Welcome back for another deep dive. We had so many questions about this one, and we're finally tackling it. Companies that are ditching traditional management altogether, like no bosses, just completely self-managed teams. It kind of blew my mind when I first heard about it.
Yeah, it's really a fascinating area. I mean, it really challenges a lot of assumptions about, leadership and how we think organizations should work.
Right, and we actually have a whole stack of research here, everything from historical analysis to case studies of companies across all kinds of industries, and honestly, some of it's pretty surprising.
It is, and it's not just theory. There are real businesses out there operating this way successfully.
Exactly. So get ready to rethink maybe everything you thought you knew about what it takes to run a successful business. I think to really wrap our heads around this, we need to start with a really basic question. How did we even get here? I mean, how did human collaboration evolve to this point where we're even questioning the need for, traditional management in the first place? What do you think?
Well, if you go way, way back, like thousands of years, right? Humans operated in small family groups, and there wasn't really formal hierarchy. I mean, it was more about shared responsibility, right? Everyone had to contribute to survival.
Right, so it's kind of like a very, very early startup,
Right, Shelly? Exactly.
Everyone pitching in just to survive.
Right, and then, of course, as communities grew, you saw the emergence of tribes, right? With elders or shamans providing guidance. But it's interesting, like even those ancient models, like the dynamics of a wolf pack or the rigid structures of like medieval societies, they still kind of find their way into modern businesses, which is crazy when you think about it.
Really? So some companies might be operating on principles from the Middle Ages. I mean, it makes you wonder, right? Is our current way of organizing work truly the most effective? Or are we just clinging to these outdated models because it's what we know?
It's a good question. It really is. And of course, I mean, we can't just, dismiss the successes of traditional management, especially, in the 20th century, right? I mean, it led to incredible gains in productivity.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And a rise in living standards for so many people.
I mean, we have everything from cars to smartphones thanks to that system, but there's got to be a trade-off, right? It seems like that efficiency often came at the expense of, worker autonomy and satisfaction. It's like that classic image of a robot on an assembly line, tirelessly turning a screw. It's super efficient, but hardly fulfilling.
It's a great analogy. And I think that's really where we see the cracks in the traditional model starting to show, right? Because the nature of work itself has changed so much. I mean, we're in an era of knowledge work, globalization, rapid technological advancements. Those old systems that were built for totally different time, I mean, they're just not as effective in this environment. Yeah. It's like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole.
It makes sense when you put it that way. I mean, and we see the results of that everywhere, right? Like employee disengagement, burnout, this constant struggle to adapt to change. It seems like, especially in fields that need complex problem solving and collaboration, those hierarchical structures can actually stifle creativity and innovation.
You're absolutely right. And so that's where we start to see, the seeds of change being planted.
Yeah.
As early as the 1920s, you had folks like Mary Parker Follett. She was already challenging the command and control approach to leadership and advocating for more collaborative models.
And then there were some early successes too, right? Like the Toyota production system. They were all about continuous improvement and empowering workers. It's kind of like they were laying the groundwork for self-management without even realizing it.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Like these early ideas were challenging really fundamental assumptions about how organizations should function. It wasn't just about, tweaking the existing system. It was about questioning its very foundation.
And that brings us to the really exciting part of this deep dive, right? The companies that decided to just go all in on ditching traditional hierarchy, it's like they're the punk rock bands of the business world. They're rejecting the norms and they're forging their own path. And you know what? It seems to be working. Exactly.
And the results are, frankly, pretty remarkable.
So let's start with a company that I think really challenges our preconceived notions about how this all works. W.L. Gore & Associates, they make Gore-Tex, right?
Yes.
They've built a multi-billion-dollar business with no job titles, no org charts, no traditional managers. I mean, how is that even possible?
I know. It's a truly radical approach. So instead of being assigned tasks, employees at Gore find commitments. These are projects that really align with their interests and their skills.
Yeah.
It's a completely self-directed system. I mean, it just blows your mind.
It does. It really does. So, I mean, how does that even work in practice? If there's no clear hierarchy, how do they make decisions? Set priorities and make sure everyone's working towards the same goal.
Well, that's what we're going to dive into next. Get ready, because this is where things get really interesting.
Okay, so we're going deep into these companies like Gore that have just completely flipped the script on traditional management. It's amazing to me that, they've achieved this incredible success, and it's not in spite of their unconventional approach, but it seems like it's actually because of it. So, what are the key principles that make these systems work? What's the secret sauce?
Well, one of the striking things, when you look at these punk rock companies, one of the common threads is this commitment to radical transparency.
Oh, interesting.
And we're not just talking about, open communication.
Yeah.
It goes way deeper than that. It's a level of openness that you just don't see in traditional organizations.
So what does that actually look like? I mean, are we talking open book financials, salaries out in the open for everyone to see? That just seems like it could create chaos, or even breed distrust if it's not handled super carefully.
Yeah, you're right. It's definitely a delicate balance. But these companies, they really believe that when everyone has access to the same information, it actually fosters a sense of shared responsibility.
Oh, okay.
And it empowers people to make more informed decisions.
I see.
Because they have all the information.
Okay, that makes sense. But wouldn't that also require a massive amount of trust? You'd have to be really confident that employees would use that information responsibly and not, for personal gain or to undermine each other or something.
You're absolutely right. And that's precisely why these organizations invest so heavily in building a culture of trust, from the very beginning. They get it. Radical transparency only works if it's built on, a foundation of shared values, clear expectations, and constant dialogue.
So it's not just about, throwing open the books and hoping for the best.
No.
There's more to it.
It's about creating an environment where that transparency actually enables trust and collaboration rather than undermining it. It's pretty amazing to see it in action.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense.
Take Bertsorg, for example. They're the nursing company we talked about earlier. They actually provide extensive training to all their self-managing nursing teams, covering everything from, communication skills and conflict resolution to, get this, financial literacy and ethical decision-making.
Wow. I mean, that's great. It makes sense, though, right? You can't just give people all this autonomy without also giving them the skills and the knowledge to actually handle it responsibly. It's like giving someone a powerful tool, but with no instructions. It could be dangerous.
It is. And these companies really get that, Empowering employees means investing in them. They don't just talk about self-management. They actively support their people in developing the skills they need to thrive in that kind of environment.
This kind of reminds me of the Rights and Responsibilities Declaration we read about at RHD. Even seemingly small details like discouraging eye rolling during discussions.
Oh, yeah. Interesting.
They had that explicitly outlined as part of their commitment to respectful communication.
That's a great point. It really highlights how intentional they are about their approach, right? Yeah. They don't leave these things to chance. They're actively shaping the culture by defining expectations, providing training and constantly reinforcing those values through their actions every single day.
It's like a complete 180 from the unspoken rules and power dynamics that you see in so many traditional workplaces, right?
Right.
But let's talk about decision making for a second. I mean, if there's no boss calling the shots, how do these organizations actually make decisions? Especially the big ones that affect the whole company.
Well, it's a process that often involves a lot of consultation and consensus building. For example, at AES, anyone could actually initiate a decision, which is pretty radical when you think about it. But then they are required to consult with everyone who would be affected by it, as well as anyone with relevant expertise, which I think is really interesting.
Okay, so it's not just a free-for-all where everyone just does whatever they want. There's still a structure and a process, but it's based on collaboration and shared responsibility rather than top-down authority.
Exactly. And that consultative approach, it extends to things like budgeting and spending, which are, typically really tightly controlled in a hierarchy. At Morningstar, for instance, teams actually develop their own budgets and investment plans. And then those plans are reviewed and challenged by a panel of colleagues, which I think is a really neat idea.
It's almost like a peer review process for financial decisions. It seems like that would foster so much more accountability than just having a manager approve or reject a budget request.
It does.
Yeah.
It really does. It creates a system where everyone has a stake in the company's success, and they're encouraged to participate in making really sound financial decisions. That's a whole different way of thinking about it.
It really is. It's a huge departure from the command and control mentality that's so prevalent in so many organizations. But what about the essential HR functions like hiring, performance evaluations? There's got to be some central authority in those areas, right? You can't just let everyone do whatever they want.
Well, that's where things get even more interesting and, honestly, maybe even a little controversial. Get ready to challenge some of your assumptions because these self-managed organizations are reimagining these core HR functions in ways that are really surprising and really innovative.
So we've been talking about how some companies are throwing out the whole traditional management playbook and they're handling decision making and budgeting in these really cool, innovative ways. But what about those core HR functions, things like hiring and performance reviews? I mean, it's tough for me to imagine those working without someone in charge.
Yeah, those are definitely areas where we often just assume you need a strong central authority, but these self-managed organizations are proving that wrong, and often in pretty surprising ways.
So how does hiring even work when there's no HR department or a hiring manager making the call? It just seems like that could get really chaotic really fast.
It's for sure different from the traditional way. In a lot of these companies, the teams themselves are actually responsible for recruiting and selecting new members.
Wait, really? The team decides who joins them. That seems like a ton of responsibility. How do they make sure they're choosing the right people? Not just someone they'll get along with, but someone who can actually do the job.
That's where the company culture and the shared values we talked about, those are so crucial. At Birchorg, for instance, potential hires go through a bunch of interviews with the team they'd be joining. And they're not just looking at skills and experience, they're also trying to see if this person aligns with their self-managing approach and if they're committed to their shared purpose.
So it's almost like a cultural fit test on steroids. They want to be really sure that the new person can not only do the job, but also thrive in that unique environment. That makes sense. But what about performance evaluations? How do they handle feedback and development when there's no manager doing those annual reviews?
Yeah, that's another area where they really break the mold. The focus shifts from individual performance to team goals and outcomes. So instead of top-down assessments, a lot of these companies use peer feedback and self-evaluation.
Interesting. Getting rid of the dreaded annual review might sound great, but it also raises some questions. How do they make sure individuals are accountable? What about dealing with performance issues or recognizing, those who are going above and beyond?
All right, those are all valid points. But these organizations have figured out ways to address them without relying on the old performance management systems. So at Morningstar, for example, teams do self-assessments, and then they present their findings to a panel of colleagues, and that includes the company's founder. It's about open communication, shared responsibility, and that constant focus on improvement.
It definitely seems more collaborative and transparent than the way most companies do it, but it also feels like it would require everyone to be really mature and have a high level of self-awareness.
Oh, absolutely. These systems rely on people taking ownership of their work, being open to feedback, and, wanting to contribute to the team's success. It's not a model that would work just anywhere, but when you've got the right environment, it can be really, really effective.
Okay, now for the question I think everyone's wondering about, salaries. Who decides how much people get paid when there's no manager setting pay grades?
This is where things get really interesting and maybe a little controversial. Some companies, like W.L. Gore and Associates, they use peer-based evaluations. So colleagues evaluate each other's work, and then they use an algorithm to come up with salary bands.
So it's kind of like a peer-reviewed salary system? That's wild. But what about bias or conflicts that could come up? It seems like that could get really messy really fast.
Yeah, for sure. It's not without its challenges. But these organizations believe that by making the process transparent and getting input from different people, they can reduce those risks and create a fairer system. They also often have ways for people to appeal if they think their evaluation was unfair, or if they need to work something out with their colleagues.
I mean, it's a super fascinating concept, but it definitely seems like it needs a ton of trust and commitment to fairness from everyone involved to actually work.
Exactly. And some companies have pushed it even further. At AES, when Dennis Beck was CEO, some departments actually experimented with letting employees set their own salaries.
Whoa, hold on. That takes self-management to a whole other level. It's hard to imagine that working in a typical company. How did they stop people from just inflating their worth or creating huge pay gaps?
It really takes a special culture, that's for sure. A strong emphasis on shared values.
Mm.
Semco, that Brazilian company we talked about, they've been doing a self-service salary system for years now, and it's working for them. Employees can see how salaries are decided, they can compare their pay to others in the industry, and they can propose their own compensation.
It's amazing to think about how much these companies are changing our ideas about how organizations can work. But let's be real for a second. These are just a few examples. What does all this mean for the rest of us, those of us who aren't working in these utopian, self-managed companies?
That's a great point. It's important to remember that these companies are outliers. They've really intentionally built their cultures and systems around self-management. But that doesn't mean there aren't things we can all learn from them, even if our companies aren't ready to go quite that far.
So what are the big takeaways? What can we learn from these punk rock companies, even if we're not ready to, you know, ditch the org chart and let everyone run free?
Well, one of the biggest things is the power of transparency. Even taking small steps, like sharing more information about the company's performance or being more open about how decisions are made, that can make a big difference in building trust and getting people more engaged.
And it sounds like building a culture of trust is key, not just saying you trust your employees, but actually showing it through your actions.
Absolutely. Giving people more autonomy, letting them make decisions, creating a space for open and honest conversations, that can really help build trust in a real, tangible way.
And what about those HR functions? Are there ways we can bring some of these self-management ideas into things like hiring and performance evaluations, even if we're still working within a traditional hierarchy?
Definitely. Involving team members in the hiring process, even if it's just in the interviews, can help make sure there's a good cultural fit and get the team more on board with the new hire. And for performance management, instead of just doing top-down evaluations, try focusing on more frequent feedback and peer-to-peer learning. It creates a much more collaborative, development-focused environment.
So while most companies aren't ready to go full-on punk rock just yet, there are definitely things we can learn from these pioneers that we can adapt and use in our own situations.
Exactly. These examples really challenge us to rethink all those assumptions we have about how organizations should work. They show us that there's not just one right way to manage people, and that empowering your employees can actually lead to incredible results.
It's a powerful reminder that work is changing. And maybe, just maybe, the companies who are brave enough to experiment and shake things up are going to be the ones who really thrive in the future.
That's definitely something worth thinking about.
This has been such a fascinating deep dive, so many great ideas to chew on. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into something interesting and thought-provoking. Until then, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep exploring those new possibilities.